So you wanna get right to the core. So you wanna know what it's all for. So you wanna come off knowing more. Well, you better get hip to Podcast by George. So you wanna get straight to the show. So you wanna know what you need to know. You wanna know what we're all here for. Well, you better get hip to Podcast by George. Podcast by George. Podcast by George. He knows what he's fighting for. It's Podcast by George. Podcast by George. Wanna know what we're fighting for?
Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome back to another podcast by George. One of the best parts about the podcast is I've made a lot of new friends, kind of personal heroes out and about the country and around the world. And one of them is returning to Podcast by George today. On the live line is Pramilla Malick. Now, she's in New York State. She's a climate activist. She's run for office out there. You've seen her on the show before. She came to national prominence, really, because she was fighting a battle out there over fracking. And in particular, they had a plant right near her home that was burning this damnable fracked gas that is really destroying the environment, including here in the heartland. We've now got fracking pipelines underneath the entire state everywhere. A result of the all of the above climate policy of the Obama-Biden administration, and people need to factor that into their consideration set in November. Not only did they put allow the pipelines to go through, but they opened up the exports internationally for fracked gas, and the whole thing took off. And so here we are sitting in fracked. We're all fracked up folks in the United States. Anyway, let's welcome her back, folks. Pramilla Malick. Hi, Pram. How you doing?
Good. Thank you for having me, George.
You know, I tell people that we live in a 2020 world in 2020. 20 minutes, we can be dead by an accidental launch from a nuclear submarine. In 20 years, we're all going to be dead from climate crisis if we don't address it in a big way immediately. That's the 2020 world. And honest to God, it was chilling last night. I turned on 60 Minutes and saw an episode that featured Jim Hansen and other climate scientists. And they're saying, folks, it's much worse than we thought it was going to be at this juncture. It's getting much worse, much more quickly. We're in big trouble. And, of course, they open by talking about the huge population-dense state of California. 4% of that state is on fire as we speak. The state fire chief was on there. He says every acre in the state is going to burn eventually. And they're at their wits' end. I mean, they don't know what to do. And, of course, that's just in the huge state of California. From a population perspective, it gets a lot of news, and rightfully so. But the climate continues to be destroyed around the globe. The ice sheets are falling apart. Flooding is drowning the southern part of the United States. The hurricanes are spinning out there in the Atlantic, and I don't want to scare the bejabbers out of you, but I'm going to keep talking about it. Each and every episode can't be on climate, but a lot of them is going to be. And Pramilla, since we last spoke, what have you been up to, and what's top of mind right now with you in the battle, the fight against the climate catastrophe?
Wow. I mean, the California wildfires really kind of put climate change in everyone's face.
Yes.
It's deeply saddening that even despite that, there is so much political inaction, so little political discussion about A, how we got here, and B, what the solutions are. Because if we don't understand how we got here, we're never going to really be able to address the root of the crisis. The root of the crisis is, honestly, it's corruption. I mean, we blame CO2 and we blame methane, and they are definitely the emissions that create global warming. But this is human-produced crises, completely unnecessary, completely avoidable as a result of corruption. And Blumenthal talks a little bit about it in the article that he wrote in the Gray Zone recently about the green groups. And it really, his article basically validated my personal experience with this fight, because as you know from the previous interview, I was a supporter of climate activism and climate change action always, However, I wasn't a climate activist until 10 years ago. Somebody cited a company, Millennium Pipeline, actually now owned by TransCanada, cited a compressor station a quarter miles from my home. And that's when I kind of discovered that the United States was changing its entire energy policy. And that change really put us on the precipice of the climate crisis we're seeing today, because we went rapidly and quite dramatically in the wrong direction in terms of mitigating, in terms of fighting climate change. And honestly, we would have been better off had we just had climate deniers in power who didn't want to do anything.
Wow.
Like, we would have, honestly, the climate would have been much better off today if we had just stuck with coal. I mean, still would have been bad, but we would have had a little bit more time. What we did is we transitioned from coal to gas, and gas is many-fold more harmful for the climate than coal. And we did that under the narrative of fighting climate change.
Yes.
And it was a grand deception, fraud perpetrated by the big green organizations that Blumenthal talks about, Sierra Club, NRDC, and sadly even 350.org to some extent. And I'll talk a little bit about the differences between these groups later on. But all of the environmental groups, because as Blumenthal talks about, they all get their funding from the same sources, and so policy, we live in a society where money writes policy, money directs policy, and whether that policy is being put forth by your legislators and politicians or by advocacy groups, it's still controlled and directed by money. And until we change that, nobody has the right, until we change the system where money dictates policy, nobody has the right to say, listen to the science, because none of these organizations, 99% of the people that I know in the climate movement are not truly listening to the science, because as you mentioned, James Hansen is one of the earliest scientists to talk about climate change, and he's done the most research on the subject, and nobody's listening to him, really. We have solutions. We've had solutions for 40 yeare and nobody's paying attention to the solutions that we have in our pocket. There are also, our way of life is really not sustainable. That's an issue that also has to be addressed. There are many ways that we can tackle this, but ultimately it's grand government policy decisions that got us into this crisis. Fossil fuels are heavily subsidized, and they have been heavily subsidized for more than 200 years. So that is the real source of the problem. If they weren't subsidized, we wouldn't be in this crisis. So now we need to transition away, and we just still don't have the political will, and we have a lot of political games being played, because when I ran for office in 2016, climate change was the center of my platform because of the issues that I've been fighting for. And for your audience that just may not know my background, I've been fighting frack gas infrastructure for the last 10 years that was cited in my community. And climate change was the center of my platform in 2016. And that really resonated with voters across the political spectrum, because our community in Orange County is very much like the Rust Belt, very conservative, but we have pockets of urban Democratic voters as well. And across the political spectrum, people know, farmers especially know, that climate change is a real, present, existential threat to our way of life, to our children's future, and it did resonate with a lot of voters. And I think the establishment took note of that, and they really had put in place for 2018 a lot of various organizations to usurp the discussion about climate change in a political context, in an election context. I think
Yes.
Sunrise was one of those organizations. And I
Well-
think it's a problem because I think that at the end of the day, there's still fossil fuel money behind the discussion and the brokers of the narrative. I call these organizations like Sunrise, like Sierra Club, like NRDC, the brokers of the narrative about climate change. They usurp the discussion. They control the discussion. They dictate how we even frame this discussion.
Well, I'm going to show the Gray Zone article that Pramilla is talking about by Max Blumenthal because it is a real eye-opener, and it comes on the heels of Planet of the Humans by Michael Moore, that movie. And a couple of things right off the top. People wanted to block that. They wanted to stop it. They wanted to censor it. Anytime something like that happens, folks, your eyebrow should be going up. Your radar, your antenna, whatever you want to call it. Censorship is never good. We need a full and open public discussion of these climate issues. And the Gray Zone's a great source for that. That movie by Michael Moore is a great source. And the transition that she's talking about is probably the biggest problem. From coal to fracked gas. They propagandized us. They told us that gas was clean. Actually, yes, fracked gas in particular is a poisonous on a scale like nobody's ever seen before. Now, I'll give you a real recent example. Like I talk about this, nobody seems to pay any attention to it. Gavin Newsom out there talking about California again has made this declaration that they're going to have all electric cars here in, I don't know, 15 years, something like that, 20 years. Yeah, well, that's all well and good, but in the meantime, he's approved 48 fracking licenses in the state of California already, and fracking is deadly, folks. That's in California. Plus the batteries, and that's what Blumenthal talks a lot about in the article, and I'm going to show that on screen as well. The transition to battery power has not been sorted out. The sources of that are lethal. The cobalt comes from the Congo. My God, you've never seen a human's right violation like cobalt mining in the Congo. And then, of course, the lithium for batteries comes from Bolivia. And guess what happens when we really need something like batteries for all the cars in California? We go and get it. How do we go and get it? At the tip of a spear. What's the tip of a spear? It's war, and that's not good for anybody. I mean, dead is dead, folks. It doesn't matter if it comes from the climate catastrophe or from above in the form of bombs and missiles, which is kind of the U.S. way of sustaining itself. Well, that's kind of a long diatribe by me, but I did want to acknowledge Jim Hansen. I'm glad that you mentioned him. I wanted to talk about that Gray Zone article by Max Blumenthal. And I don't know. I guess the point that I would make here next is that everybody that like the news cycle, it's so frustrating. I don't know how you stay with it, Pramilla, because everybody's talking about Donald Trump's health and the fact that he's denying science when it comes to coronavirus. And I look at that and say, yeah, but he's most likely going to survive this. Another thing is we're most likely going to survive coronavirus. What aren't we going to survive? The climate, and it could be happening in 20 years. I don't know. Nobody's got an accurate timetable, but I'm scared. I got to tell you, I'm really frightened. Pramilla, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly why I'm doing this. I have 4 children. I hope they have children. I'm worried about my children's future. I'm very sure that they're going to be dealing with really inhospitable conditions very shortly in their lives as they become adults, and I think that we're, as I said, all of our politicians are asleep at the wheel and or driving us in the wrong direction. The organizations that claim to be on the forefront of the fight against climate change are just deception, and they're frauds, and nobody is, the general public supports action on climate change, but nobody really understands what that action needs to be, because it does require sweeping big government action like the Marshall Plan. And it's possible, but they muddy the waters by using all of these code woke trigger words like, environmental justice and just transition. And the truth of the matter is that all of these facilities, these fracking facilities, are being sited in poor communities. The communities of color are the most defenseless. Like this power plant that we've been fighting has been sited in around 14 environmental justice communities, and was specifically cited in that location because they thought, oh, those people are they're expendable and they won't have the resources to fight back. And so therefore, I, of course, support the concept of environmental justice, but the way it's used by these organizations is really deceptive. Because, for example, in New York State, there was a climate bill that they got passed. And the climate bill used the rhetoric about environmental justice and just transition. But basically, the mandate of the bill was to take funds from that were designed for that were originally by law mandated to be used for renewable energy projects, and to basically distribute them amongst environmental justice communities under the idea that these people have been a victim of pollution for many decades, and therefore they deserve compensation. Well, we said, why not just separate it? Let's keep the climate bill focused on the climate science, and then you can have another bill to deal with any kind of compensation for environmental justice communities. But by allowing the state to take those funds from renewable energy projects, basically what they were doing was reducing the amount of renewable energy the state could end up deploying.
Wow.
Originally, the way the bill was written, it would have killed the solar industry in New York State altogether. Because the thing is, when you build a solar plant or when you build wind farms, you have to put it where there's sun and where there's wind. You can't just put it wherever you feel like. You can't put it in an environmental justice community just because, you think of it as a compensation. And we said to environmental justice, to people who are using this rhetoric, we said, look, what environmental justice communities like ours near this power plant need is for us to cut down the pollution first. We need to halt the harm. We need to stop them from being poisoned in the first place. You can't just throw money at a problem.
Right.
If people are getting sick, if people are getting, air pollution, then just throwing money at the problem is not going to help the situation. They push forth that narrative because it was a convenient way of playing games with real policy decisions that need to be made in terms of how much wind and solar are you able to deploy. And then there's another issue with wind and solar, which Michael Moore goes into in this film, which is, the mining of all those products that have to, that are used in the industry, by the industry, and then the ecological footprint, which is another big concern.
Plus how inefficient they are. And that kind of gets to the point that I want to get to next, which is we do need this government assistance. We do need the bully pulpit. My God, where have these presidents of the United States been since Jim Hansen started talking about this in 1988? We need people. It's not just them, folks. It's us. We've got to change our behavior, and that might be the biggest overriding issue here. I mean, in Blumenthal's article, that statistic about the fact that, and I've got a lot of lefty friends that love to go cruising. I mean, they want to go across the Atlantic in a cruise ship, Royal Caribbean Cruises. That one ship they have that crosses the Atlantic, Blumenthal says statistics show that it uses as much diesel, contributes as much pollution as 5 million cars making the same trip across the Atlantic. I mean, that is absolutely mind-blowing. So as people, what are we going to have to do? Well, we're going to have to maybe use the air conditioner every other day. We're going to have to stay home. I mean, gasoline is $2 a gallon where I live because of subsidies, basically. And people are driving around for fun. I live in a little bitty town out here in the sticks that's probably akin to Mayberry, and they're writing city legislation to allow people to drive around on the streets in dune buggies and golf carts for fun. I mean, we've got to change the way that we live. I mean, every other day you might have to sit by a window and read a book. That's where we've gotten to. That's how bad this crisis is. Nobody wants to do it, but we've got to do it if you want Pramilla's children and grandchildren and all of our children and grandchildren to survive all of this. Well, again, we're running out of time. I'd love to have you on the show. I did want to show this one clip, Pramilla. I'm going to throw this up because it actually was one of the most popular clips that I had on the podcast back when you were on many months ago prior to the Iowa caucuses. We were talking about the political candidates, and we asked you to grade them, and it was really insightful. And here's what you had to say when I asked you about Joe Biden.
He was part of Obama's all of the above energy policy, which really translated into total commitment to fracking. And so in 2015, the entire country began consuming more power from fracked gas than any other fuel source. And that was a monumental shift in our energy policy in the wrong direction. We should have been moving to hydro, wind, solar, and nuclear still has to be on the table because it's the only baseload carbon-free source of energy. But we committed 100% to frack gas at that point. So he was part of that. Biden, terrible record.
Let's grade these folks. I mean, it's not going to be anything precise, but A to F. We'll just take a quick spin through here. Give Biden give him a grade.
F.
An F.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So that's a big fat F, folks, for Joe Biden. His climate policies have been disastrous over the course of his 40-plus years of legislative career. Now, Pramilla, what I'm telling people is with Donald Trump, we got no chance. The man cannot be reelected. He's proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that he's not going to do anything on this climate crisis. If he fiddles while the world burns another 4 years, based on what Jim Hansen and these climate scientists are telling us, I think it could be game over. We'll be far too past the curve. We won't be able to do anything about it. Joe Biden, like him or not, and I don't particularly like him very much, he's a politician. He reminds me of a Richard Nixon. He reminds me of an LBJ, somebody like that. If you get into the streets, if you protest, if you strike, if you shut things down, he will be forced to do something. He's an ideologue. He can be made, I think, to do something. Donald Trump is not a politician. He's a game show host, folks. He's a narcissist. He's a nut, for lack of a better description. You're not going to make him do anything, and I hope if we vote for Joe Biden and get him in there, he will do something. And maybe first and foremost, my God, we need a carbon tax. We need to tax this carbon coming out of the ground from these fossil fuels. So I don't know. That's where I'm at. Pramilla, where do you stand on the presidential election?
Yeah, I mean, Trump is definitely the greater of two evils. Not only do we have a slight glimmer of hope with Biden, and I'm hoping that Bernie has some leverage over Biden, because he's out campaigning for him now. But Trump is definitely completely owned by the fossil fuel industry. The company that I have been fighting, and they build these frack gas power plants all over the country. They've built one in the LA area as well. They're building one now for the Chicago metro area. They actually, their CEO was actually on Trump's advisory team, and their one of their executives' father was in a lobbying firm with Roger Stone. So, he's very entrenched with the oligarchy, make no mistake about it. And he's definitely trying very hard to gut the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. Like, he talks about clean air and clean water, but he has gone in the opposite direction. Because of our fight in Minisink and our fight with this pipeline, he has actually increased the amount of power and control that pipeline companies have to come in and just take your property and take your farms and take your homes. He's increased that ability, and they had a lot of power to start out with. 10 years ago under Obama, Trump has given them more authority and more power. So he is the worst of the worst. Biden is not much better, but a little bit better. He's a little bit better in the sense that I guess he wants to, ban fracking on public lands. And, hopefully he'll bring back the Obama methane regulations. But, he's likely also in the pockets of the fossil fuel industry. So it's really up now to people power to organize amongst themselves, grassroots, independent people power, not under the umbrella of these organizations. These organizations are really, really dangerous, these environmental groups. They are very much part of the corruption that has created fossil fuel climate crisis. And, we've even been protesting, some of them, we protested Riverkeeper recently. And, we said publicly that the California wildfires are on you, organizations like Sierra Club and NRDC. So I would say we need to continue to organize. We need to listen to the scientists like James Hansen. I wrote an article with James Hansen. He's an advocate of nuclear power. And at this moment in time, nuclear power seems to have the least ecological impact, and it produces carbon-free energy. And we just can't afford to let that go right now. What I would say is we need to ban all fracked gas, all use of gas, methane. I'm completely convinced that the California wildfires are a result of enormous methane in the atmosphere. We're at over 1,900 parts per billion of methane. We were just at 1,800 last year. So yes, the scientists are right. Everything is accelerating much more rapidly than scientists had predicted 10, 20 years ago. And the reason is because scientists did not know that industry was plotting and planning the advent of this new technology known as fracking, which would, exponentially exacerbate everything in terms of climate change.
Can't be underestimated. And Biden says, I'm not going to ban fracking. And a lot of people look at that. A lot of people, believe it or not, think fracking is a good alternative. They think it's quasi-green or something like that. Honest to God.
It is the most dangerous form of energy we could possibly have. We're better off with just coal. or burning wood. Again, these are not things that I advocate for, but it's way better than gas. Gas is the worst possible form of energy from a climate and public health perspective. It's an entirely unregulated industry. Fracking is entirely unregulated. There are no regulations for it. But look, everything has to be part of the solution: wind, water, solar, and nuclear power. We have to change our lifestyle. Michael Moore was 100% right about that.
Big time.
There's things that cannot be about profit. And I think energy should be, the delivery of energy should be a public controlled resource throughout the country. The company that I'm fighting now is just about to get bought by a Singapore and Israeli company. So we've got foreign corporations controlling the American energy sector. What kind of energy independence is that?
There you go.
That's not energy independence. That's almost reverse colonization, actually.
Oh, God. Well, that'll be a topic for another show. We're out of time. Honest to God, and I love to put these photos up and this is why Pramilla Malick is a hero of mine. She's just not a talker, folks. She's a walker. I've got these photos of her holding the sign and walking the line. I mean, she'll be out there, and that's what we've got to do to get this accomplished. Change our behavior and change the behavior of our elected politicians, or it's going to be game over more quickly than anybody thinks. Pramilla, thanks again for coming back on another podcast by George.
Thank you for having me, George.
And we'll revisit this again soon. I love having her on, and I can't talk about the climate often enough. And if you check out that article in the Gray Zone, or even watch the 60 Minutes episode from last night, you'll see why. But again, that's going to do it. That's going to wrap it up. If you like Podcast by George, check us out. Go to iTunes, go to YouTube or Spotify, the iHeartRadio app. And of course, our home away from home, where we seem to get a lot of people to watch us, is on Facebook. That's going to do it. That's going to wrap it up, folks. We're out of time for this one. That's all there is, and there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.